Nonviolent communication is basically a conflict resolution model developed by Marshall Rosenberg. I got my first exposure to conflict resolution at a summer camp where we had kids use it for any conflict they had. For me personally, it blew me away because I grew up in a family where all we did was have conflict. There was never any resolution, a lot of yelling, not a lot of listening, absolutely no dialogue. Everybody just trying to get their needs met, but very little openness to cooperation and working things out. So when I started working at this camp, I'd never heard of anything like it. And when they sat down, Billy and Joey, and had them discuss their feelings around the cookie that Billy took from Joey, where one minute they wanted to kill each other, the next minute, it really only took a few minutes, they were best friends again. It completely blew me away. So NVC, nonviolent communication, is conflict resolution on some very healthy, organic, non-GMO steroids. What I want to do is first go over a couple of core concepts. It's actually a very, very rich model. I could probably talk about it for a few hours, but I want to focus on a couple of core concepts. Then we'll go over the basic steps. It's got actually very similar to conflict resolution. I won't get into that yet. We'll go over the basic 4 steps that this model has for conflict resolution, and then go over a couple more concepts just to kind of wrap it up and bring it all together. So first core concept in NVC is no matter what people are saying or doing, they're always saying one of two things. They're either saying please or thank you. And if you can fully wrap your brain around that concept, you will never hear criticism again. And I'll get more to that later in this talk. But basically, if you think about it, no matter what people are doing or saying, they're either saying, please meet this need, or thank you for meeting this need. And it's all about needs, which is actually one of the steps in NVC. So in NVC, there are basically 2 different ways you could say please or thank you. He uses symbols, the giraffe and Jackal. And if you've ever seen him give a talk or any of his videos, speaking of which, my absolute favorite resource of his is the introductory video, The Basics of Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. It's basically filming of one of his trainings, one of his beginner trainings. I've probably seen this over 10 times. I mean, I know, probably getting close to 20 now. Very rich, there's a lot in this one program. And then if you're more of a reader, the basic book, the introductory book, is Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life, also by Marshall Rosenberg. So those are 2 resources. And so you'll see in the videos he uses puppets, Giraffe and Jackal, and it basically symbolizes 2 different ways of seeing the world. So Jackal, we'll start with that. And he's got no good reasons for using Jackal. It just kind of stuck and fit. There are some reasons why he uses Giraffe, which I'll explain when we get to that. But with the Jackal language, he breaks it down into 4 types of communication that basically alienate us from one another. They're dehumanizing forms of communication. The one I focus on mostly in my work is criticism, and that can take a lot of different forms. Any kind of right-wrong language, judgments, moralistic evaluation, attack thinking, any kind of demonizing or even idealizing. Anytime you use a label to describe somebody, it's dehumanizing. If I said, oh Billy, you're such a good kid for working it out with Joey, not always, nobody's anything all the time. One moment, Billy might be what I think is good. Somebody else might think the same thing isn't good, for example. But then the next minute, Billy might be doing something else that doesn't meet my needs, and I might want to judge it as bad. It really doesn't tell us anything about people or what they're doing, good, bad, right, wrong. They're pretty meaningless descriptors. So criticism is one. Comparisons is another way we can dehumanize other people or ourselves. He has a phrase, compare and despair. And they've done studies in the eating disorder field, which I specialize in. They talk a lot about the studies of people reading People magazine, and consistently after a person reads People magazine, they feel more depressed. And what they've figured is it's because of the comparisons that we tend to make when we see Hollywood types who have unrealistic beauty as defined by our social norms, social expectations. So it's really, especially according to NBC, it's never helpful or appropriate to compare. Everybody is unique and different. Arguably everyone's doing the best they can. It makes a lot more sense more times than not to assume positive intent from whatever anybody's doing. And so to compare them to somebody who's doing better just isn't fair. It's a very dehumanizing way of trying to relate to them. And then the next one is any kind of denial of responsibility. Any language that communicates that we don't have a choice is not true. You always have a choice. You may not like the choices you have, but to ever go into that consciousness is violent and can cause a lot of damage. He gives one of the most extreme examples you can think of in this video, the Basics of Nonviolent Communication, where he talks about one of the Nazi leaders, and they were interviewing him, and they asked, how could you all do this? How did it come about? Like, we want to understand. And basically what this person described was that they had a type of language in the German army, and they called it Amtssprachen, which loosely translates to bureaucratic speak. The bottom line is it meant I'm following orders. Why did you do this? Because somebody told me I had to. I had no choice. Therefore, I'm not responsible. But you always have a choice. You may not like the choices that you have, but you always have a choice. And they may be difficult choices, but you always have a choice. And it's really important in order to not cause violence to others, to yourself, to remember that. And then the last one, which we'll get into when we go through the steps, are demands. Demand is a Jackal form of communication. It's violent, basically because it's a power over dynamic. Any kind of domination structure, whether it's in language or in an actual organization, is violent because everybody wants their freedom. Many people have died to preserve freedom for themselves, their families, their friends. And that's because it's such a core human need. The unschooling movement does a great job of talking about how anytime you put children in that case in a constrained environment, you are immediately creating unnatural behavior from the child. And a lot of that just boils down to freedom. We need autonomy and to know that we can control our world and have some agency. So those are the 4 basic Jackal forms of communication: criticism, any kinds of comparisons, denial of responsibility, and demands. And mainly in my work as a therapist, we're looking a lot at criticisms and judgments, that first category. Now, if you think about Jackal, all of those have one common goal. So, and this may be the most important thing to remember about Jackal. It's basically, you can sum it up as I'm right, you're wrong. That is the goal. Anytime you are communicating with any of those, your intention is to be right, to make someone else wrong, or to describe how you're wrong and someone else is right. Always an imbalance of power there, always creates violence. Giraffe, the best way to really understand is to think about its primary intention. So as opposed to I'm right, you're wrong, the only thing giraffe consciousness truly cares about is connection. Period. It doesn't care about who's right, who's wrong. It doesn't worry about labeling, all the things we've talked about with Jackal, completely irrelevant. All a giraffe speaker wants is to stay connected to the other person. And if you think about that, that has profound ramifications for what you would say, how you would say it, and it just changes your whole intention and how you approach situations and people. So if you think back to the first concept I mentioned, no matter what people are saying, they're either saying please or thank you. In order to continue to see people's behavior that way, oh, they must just be saying please. You're focusing on staying connected to what need they're trying to meet. And that's really the key. Marshall Rosenberg talks a lot about staying connected to what's alive inside the other person, and that's what you're wanting. And of course there are two sides to that. You want to stay connected to what's alive inside of the other person. He talks about it as being a divine energy. We don't have to go spiritual with it. It's simply what we get most excited about when we understand that about somebody else. And there are a couple of psychotherapy models that do a great job exploring that or really focusing on that. One of them is imagotherapy by Harville Hendricks. One of the main interventions I learned when I was studying that modality was when you have a couple working something out, the main intervention is you have one of the partners listen and just continue to ask either open-ended questions, or their main phrase was, is there more? Is there more? Is there more? And in that model, it's very loose in terms of what the other person could or would say. As the listener, you just want to keep listening until something clicks and you get it. And you may go from a state of being really upset and angry at your partner, but as you're listening, eventually you get enough context where it makes so much sense. You understand and you forgive and you feel connected. That's what we're looking for. That's when you are able to really touch into what's alive inside the other person, and that's always beautiful. It's a divine energy. And we'll get to how NVC frames this. It's actually one of the only approaches I think I have found that gives you a tangible way to see people with what Course in Miracles calls it Christ consciousness. Or like we talked about with unschooling, where you see children in particular as having positive intent, or being able to just recognize no matter what people are doing, even if we don't like how they're doing it, they're just saying please meet this need. Being able to see them with that much unconditional compassion and open-heartedness can be very challenging. And this model, it's not an easy way of doing it, but it's a simple way of doing it. It could take years and years to master. For example, I worked at those summer camps. I think at the time it was over 10 years by the time I found NVC in 2004. And it still took me a couple of years, even though I had years of training with a model that was a little bit simpler. It still took me a couple of years to feel like I had any kind of competency in nonviolent communication. But I can tell you, it's absolutely worth it to be able to have the ability, if somebody's doing something that most people just get really triggered by, to be able to just look at it and say, oh wow, they're asking, please meet my need for respect. And for me not to react, and be able to stay connected to them is such a valuable skill that if you end up working with me, or if you have worked with me, I definitely push it, and we do a lot of work on trying to master it, or at least gain some proficiency in it. So we got the two different types of languaging, or I would say these are different levels of consciousness, or maybe not putting it in terms of levels because that would be Jackal, but types of consciousness. I'm right, you're wrong consciousness versus I want to stay connected consciousness. So now let's talk about the 4 steps. In the conflict resolution model I used at the summer camp, it was basically, when you did this, I felt, and what I want is. And even that, as much as I think NVC is even better, even that simple model, it was just miracle after miracle. Simply having people sit down and hear each other's side of that. This is what you did that upset me, made me feel blank, and this is what I'd like. But then letting the other person, of course, also share. That's critically important to understand, that this can't be a one-sided conversation. Very important to remember the concept of dialogue as opposed to monologue. Most of what we do is monologue, when we're in conflict especially. All of Jackal is monologue. It's one person just throwing something at another. No connection there. And if you want to experience this rich, beautiful, I would just call it love. And in NVC, they actually basically say, if you want to, one of the best ways to express love or experience love is to do what he calls a giraffe dance, which is where you both share what your feelings and needs are and understand that about one another. And there's a feeling that comes with that's what NVC describes as love. So the 3 steps, and I'll compare the 2 because I think NVC is so much cleaner. So let's take the first one, when you. NVC's version of that is state the observable behavior. Much, much cleaner than just saying, when you acted like a schmuck, when you stole my cookie. In NVC, they clean that up quite a bit. I mean, you can hear the jackalness in when you acted like a schmuck. Schmuck's a judgment, that's a criticism. When you stole my cookie, maybe they weren't stealing, maybe they thought it was theirs. That's an assumption, which would also be Jackal. Observable behaviors are only what you can see. I just like to call it the observables. You stick to the observables. And Rosenberg describes a metaphor of a video camera. It's basically what a video camera would pick up. So how would I clean up when you stole my cookie? When you walked over, picked up my cookie without asking me if you could have it, and then walked away and ate it. A little wordier. That's the thing. One of the things you give up when you speak Giraffe versus Jackal, not all the time, but at least some of the time, is it might take more words, but what you gain is that people are much more likely to hear what you have to stay connected to it, to not get defensive and reactive and feel or perceive that they're being attacked, if you can just state what happened. If you can keep it to the observables, it's much, much cleaner. So first step, cleanly describe as clean as you can what happened. And if you practice with this, and it's funny, they show, not funny, well, funny from a certain perspective, probably not for them while it's happening, but they have audience members trying to do this, and he just takes the audience through the 4 different steps. So the first one is, describe something somebody did that made life less wonderful for you, and try to only keep it to observable behaviors. And maybe it was selective editing, but person after person, they struggle with this. And I think if you tried this, you would struggle too. I've run a lot of groups where we practice this model, and very rarely do I find somebody who first time can describe things as they are with no evaluation, no judgments. So give it a try, and I think you'll be surprised at how challenging just that first step can be. Second step, similar to the one we used at camp, basically state how you feel. But Marshall Rosenberg has a nice way of cleaning that one up. In our languaging, in the United States at least, it's very common for us to use feeling words that are actually evaluations and judgments. For example, when you took my cookie, I felt violated. Violated says more about the other person than it does about what's alive inside of you. You're judging the person as a violator. Another common one I hear in my work is, when you did XYZ, I felt abandoned. You are abandoning me is more what that's saying, as opposed to what I might feel inside. Now, we're probably smart enough to hear those words and infer some feelings, but again, it's much cleaner, and people will have an easier time hearing it without getting defensive or perceiving criticism if you can clean it to a basic feeling. So let's take those two examples. I felt violated, possibly scared. In the cookie example, if we keep it in that context, maybe more angry and frustrated. Those are cleaner words than I felt violated, i.e. you violated me. Abandoned, maybe the feeling underneath that or embedded in that is loneliness. I felt alone, abandoned. Yeah, probably lonely would be my best guess in the moment. And here's the good news. When you are trying to, and we're going to get to this in a moment, right now I'm describing trying to receive empathy from somebody, trying to get them to connect to what's alive inside of you. Again, there has to be two sides to this in order for the process to be complete. There's giving empathy. So if I was giving empathy to someone, and we will get to this more later after we go through the 4 steps of asking for empathy. These are 4 steps if you want empathy. You want someone to connect with what's alive inside of you. But let's say somebody was asking please in a way that was maybe Jackal. Immediately, if I'm perceiving any kind of upset or pain, and if they're having trouble communicating in a giraffe way, then I better be listening in giraffe. I better have my giraffe ears on, and then I'm giving empathy. I'm trying to connect to what's alive inside of the other person. So in terms of if somebody uses those words, like violated or abandoned, I'm trying to empathize with what's really alive in that. Okay, so let's move on to needs. So first one, observable. Second step, what I felt. That's the same thing we would do at camp 2. The third step, we didn't do this at the camp. I wish we did more consistently. The third step are, what are your needs? And these are universal needs, meaning needs that everybody has. It's never a behavior or a request or a demand. I need you to do this, I need you to do that. It is, I have a need for respect. Universal need. Every human being on the planet has a need for respect. Earlier I talked about freedom. Every human being has a deep, deep desire for freedom. And we could talk about a bunch of others that are core for everybody. And then for what makes us different is we might have different needs at different times. I gave an earlier example. If we saw Billy doing something, it might meet my need for entertainment, but it might not meet another person's need for respect. I find it funny, they find it not so respectful. That's what makes us unique. And so the beautiful thing about adding in needs is that when you're describing, when you took my cookie, observable, I felt frustrated feeling because it didn't meet my need for boundaries or private property. I'm connecting the feelings to the need as opposed to connecting the feelings to what the person did, which is what the camp conflict resolution model, that's what tends to happen. When you took my cookie, it made me feel frustrated. I'm blaming, which is denial of responsibility. That is a Jackal consciousness. So NVC, this is probably the most powerful difference between those two models, is the difference of the needs is that you are taking full responsibility for what you feel, and that's another core concept in NVC. You are entirely responsible for how you feel. Not necessarily for how you get influenced, but how you feel is your responsibility based on not what they did, it's because you have certain needs. So again, this cleans it up. And just listen to the difference. Billy, when you took my cookies, it made me feel frustrated, and I want you to leave my cookies alone. Versus, Billy, when you took my cookies, I felt frustrated because that didn't meet my need for private property. And then we'll get to the last step, which is request. But can you feel the difference between the two? NVC, at least to me, feels a lot more gentle and respectful, and it doesn't come across like an attack or blame or criticism. So very, very powerful. And really, needs, I believe that's the core of this model. Feelings and needs, really, those are where it's at. When he talks about what's alive inside of each person, what's alive inside the other person, what's this divine energy, he's talking about feelings and needs. And again, there's another psychotherapy model, emotionally focused therapy, which is a couples model developed by Sue Johnson, where basically, I mean, when I've seen her work, I don't have a lot of experience with it, but I've seen her work on some videos. A lot of what she's doing is, as people are talking, she simply reflects back what she thinks that person is feeling. That's it. It's a very simple looking intervention, but it has powerful, powerful effects. And a lot of that just in her framework deals with attachment and how people attach to each other, which is a whole nother talk. But it's incredibly powerful. It cuts through to some very deep parts of who we are when people can see what we feel. And then NVC takes it one step further. When people can recognize the need we're trying to express, at the least it gives you another way you can connect, but I would argue that it actually makes the connection even deeper, more thorough, more rich. And then we get to the last step if you're trying to ask for empathy, and that's making a request, which is directly related to what I mentioned earlier about Jackal. You're not making demands. You never make a demand. If you're speaking Giraffe, which basically means when you're making a request, you are honoring that person's free will. And a giraffe can hear no and be perfectly okay with it. That's how you know whether you're making a request or making a demand. If I say, Billy, I have a really important request, it's that you never take my cookies again. And if it's a request, Billy can say no, absolutely not. At that point, it's important for me, and I'm okay with it if it's a request. All I hear in that moment, it's not a rejection, it's not a denial of my needs. What I hear is Billy's need for empathy. If I approached Billy with these 4 steps, with wanting to do conflict resolution, I'm asking for him to connect to what's alive inside of me. Maybe he heard me, maybe he was connected to it and he understands my needs for private property, but if he says no to my request, then there are some needs that I need to then connect to inside of him. So I would get curious. If I was totally in giraffe mode, I would actually celebrate the fact that he's saying no, because I would never want anybody to say yes to a need of mine if it didn't also meet their needs. Remember that this is about both sides being seen, having their needs met. If only one side is being seen and having their need met, it's imbalanced, and at some point everyone pays for it. There's going to be resentment, anger, frustration. It'll come out later. You don't want to be what he calls a yes jackal, somebody who just says yes to everyone else's needs at the expense of their own, and then eventually down the road there's some sort of blow up. But even if there isn't, in the moment there's a disconnection. You have no connection. We can only really connect with one another when we're clear about who we are and we have something that people can meet up against and have a boundary where there can be that contact. So for me to really feel connected to Billy, if he says no, if I'm listening to it in the right way, I'm ecstatic because I'm getting to see more of who Billy really is. I'm getting closer to the divine energy inside of him. So I'm putting on my giraffe ears. If he says no, I might start asking questions, but I'm maybe a semi-smart guy. I could try guessing immediately. But at some point, we'd maybe get to the possibility that Billy was hungry. Billy's not the stealing type, and he had a need for nourishment, a need for nutrition. So now, let's say that is his needs. The man felt hungry. The man maybe felt anxious. He felt hangry, had a need for nourishment. I have a need for boundaries. At that moment, the magic happens. We can actually connect. And the reason universal needs is so powerful is because they are universal. Maybe not in that moment did I have a need for nourishment, because I wasn't eating the cookie, they were just sitting there. But I can relate to that as a human being. There have been times where I have felt hangry, I've had a need for nourishment, and as soon as I connect to that inside of Billy, we become more human to each other. He becomes more human to me. I've been there before. And then if I can frame it in a way, Billy, I have needs for private property, I have needs for boundaries. Billy at different times has his own needs for private property and boundaries. He wouldn't want me taking his Pearl Jam CD. And I can understand that. He can understand, my needs for the cookie. So that's one of the reasons why it creates that connection. We've all got these universal needs. The problem is, with a lot of communication, we start off just making demands or even requests. And if I make a demand or a request and it does not meet the other person's need, we're in instant power struggle mode. And that's where a lot of communication starts. If you just think about at the home, mom doesn't come in and say, sweetheart, I feel exhausted. I'd really love some support right now. I just had a long day of work. It would mean a lot to me. It would meet my need for support, and maybe give me a chance to rest if you could help pick up some of these clothes. That feels a lot easier to say yes to than, sweetheart, I need you to pick up these clothes. Even if I said that nicely, there's no connection around feelings and needs. I go straight to the request. And as a giraffe, you don't want to make a request that doesn't at least potentially give some thought to, how did this meet both people's needs? So back to the cookie example. If I was being a better giraffe than what I described earlier, I might have said, Billy, when you took my cookies, I felt frustrated, didn't meet my needs for private property. My request is, and now I'm thinking, okay, I know I have a need for boundaries. I'm guessing Billy was really hungry because dinner's late and I don't know what they're doing back there in the kitchen, but I'm ready for some grilled cheese too. He must just be starving. So a request that might be both of our needs, for his needs for nourishment, my need for boundaries, is, Billy, could you next time just ask me if you want a cookie, and I'll see if I have enough to share, or I'll help you find something to eat, because I know what it's like to be hungry at camp. That is a giraffe request. Giraffe requests already put some thought into what the other person's needs might be, and what request could I make that would meet both of our needs. And again, if I completely fail, it's fine. If he says no, I celebrate it. It's an opportunity to connect to what's truly alive inside of Billy. I might find out that he's diabetic and needed the cookie, and man, then do I feel differently. Steal all the cookies you want whenever you want. I don't want you passing out. You got to take care of your blood sugar. No's are incredibly powerful opportunities to connect deeper with somebody. We should celebrate them. In our culture, though, where we are trained to find better and better ways to just have power over each other, we tend to label it as oppositional, defiant. Usually those are the most interesting people in organizations, the ones that don't get along. Try to find out why. What are they thinking? What are their needs? Why do they maybe not agree? Could open up the door to a lot of rich developments and growth. So here's the good thing about listening in Giraffe. You don't have to be right. You're making guesses with all of this. Like I mentioned in passing, assumptions is Jackal. You don't ever want to make assumptions. You want to really be present with people and not know. Stay curious. It's a discovery. And if you're going into I'm going to give empathy mode, you're just making guesses. Don't talk about it as if you know what they're feeling, what their need is. Don't use that tone. Don't inflect it in that way. Ask questions. Are you feeling scared? Could you be feeling vulnerable? That'd actually be a need. Or, yeah, a need. But I imagine I might have a need for respect. But let them correct you. It's not important to be right about any of this. It's important to connect. And it doesn't necessarily matter who, I mean, doesn't matter who names the right need or feeling, you, the other person. Yes, you do want to get there because there's something powerful about when that gets named for somebody. And you'll see it in their body language, just how relaxing it can be, how disarming it can be. So you definitely want to get to the right one, but don't worry about the process. As long as you're genuinely curious, there's something that's very healing about that. There's something very disarming about just that. So that's just one of the good news items about NVC. You're just making guesses. You don't have to get it perfect. It's a chance to just discover. I think that's basically it for now. So hopefully this has given you a nice overview, introduction, maybe review to nonviolent communication. Again, I could not recommend this program enough if you want to get more into it. And we will be producing some more videos about other nonviolent communication concepts. So stay tuned for those. Thank you for your attention.
Some say love